I would like to start with some informal remarks to try to link the contents of this paper to the other ideas that have been explored here this morning and this afternoon. To begin with, I am a great disbeliever in general terms. You know, the state, the market, the surveillance society, all those big capitalism. I'll explain in a second what I mean by that. But I mean, there's something about big terms that try to be too general that actually end up missing the mark, because instead of giving us a concrete sense of power mechanisms, a concrete sense of systems of exploitation, a more concrete sense of what's at stake politically and all these things, terms that are too general end up leading the discussion to another plane, a plane in which we lose sight of the more concrete. Just to give you an example. And of course this becomes even worse when we tend to demonize certain terms, to make them evil, or to add a connotation of evil to them. This is very clear, for instance, in the case of the word control. Typically, we associate control with control by the state, which is, of course, not a good thing. Too much control by the state, too much monitoring of individual behavior, too much tracking of individual habits, too much knowledge on the part of some central agency about who we are. We also tend to think about control in terms of corporations, the way they control our habits, the way they control our wallets, the way they control our lives in many cases, because the same corporation that owns, say, oil will also own seed, and a lot of the things that go into farming, so they not only produce insecticides and herbicides and pesticides and other products made out of oil, they also now control seeds and control many of the other inputs that go into a farm. And that is a very dangerous thing, to have certain institutions controlling all the main inputs that go into the human food chain. Not only because they can do things like the British do, you know, feeding brains to the cows and ending up in a situation, Britain is the only place in the world where you have to order your steak medium sane. You don't go to many places where you have to worry about the mental health of your cow, So there is something to be said about accumulations of control in the hands of certain agencies. But think about this, for instance, in terms of just the word control, or the demonization of the word control. When we talk about, for instance, abortion rights for women, what we are talking about is switching control from the state, or from whatever community is making abortion a religious issue, and giving control to the nurture, right? I mean, we want the person who's going to spend 9 months with the baby and then later on taking care of the baby to have control over her own body. So clearly, in that case, to have control is not a bad thing. It's in fact an achievement of the women's movement to have gained that degree of control over your bodies, and it is not by any means final achievement, since this, particularly in the States, is constantly being challenged by the religious right. So it's not an achievement or a triumph that one can take for granted. It's a conquest of a certain degree of control over our own bodies that then cannot be surrendered again. So clearly, whether control is a bad thing or a good thing depends on a lot more than just control. It depends on the locus of control, who's doing the controlling. It depends on the degree of concentration of power of those who are doing the controlling. And the dispersion of control, in this case, the dispersion of control to the individual nurture, has to be considered a good thing. So it's important not to demonize certain words. I mean, a similar thing happens to the word power. We tend to demonize the word power as if all power was bad. But of course, we want power over our lives, and we want one more example. In the left, we've tended for the longest time, this is the example that actually connects with my subject matter here, which is intellectual property or copyrights. In the left, whether we are Marxists or we are just inherited some Marxistoid ideas from 150 years in which Marxism has dominated the left, we have learned to demonize money and demonize markets. Typically, if someone in a conference comes out defending markets, it's immediately labeled as some kind of right-wing free marketeer. And we have words like commodification, the transformation of something into a commodity, that for the left, for 90% of people in the left, is a bad word. When you say something has been commodified, something has been made into a commodity, well, that's the end of the world, and that's it, that's evil, that's bad. And so, instead of adopting an attitude towards economics, which brings to the attitude that I adopt and certain historians like Manuel De Landa adopt, which is the attitude, we still don't know what economic systems are. We're still beginning to figure out how they work, rather than having a final theory. We're still kind of working it out. And when we have to work out theories, the best attitude is an experimental attitude. Rather than demonizing markets and demonizing money and making them evil, we should try to see in what assemblages, in what combinations, money and private property are indeed a nurturing or a complexifying force, something that actually helps the mixture, and in what other combinations money and private property become indeed poisonous of community relationships, poisonous of cities and the vitality and of innovators and creators within cities. In other words, it's a matter of going one case at a time, examining it in detail and getting very concrete about how we examine the different assemblages, the different combinations of rights and obligations and indeed forms of control and power to try to find the right hybrids for humanity. The things that come out of demonizing generalities like demonizing the market and then going for socialism or state-planned economies, for instance, or demonizing surveillance and embracing some kind of utopian world in which there will be no surveillance, is much less useful than analyzing concrete cases. So I say this because I will be talking about something that is going on right now in the world that is very important, which is normally intellectual property rights, as copyrights over a book, copyrights over music, copyrights over a movie or images in an illustrated images, are an important part of the economy, but they have become much more important with the creation of the internet. And the creation of the internet, which has also made the free transfer of intellectual property extremely cheap or extremely frictionless, has made now the international corporations who own intellectual property get very, very nervous and lobby, particularly in the United States Congress, for much tougher ways of enforcing, surveying and monitoring the uses of intellectual property, and then enforcing those intellectual property rights. Now, given that the internet has, really taken over a lot of what used to be distribution channels for intellectual property, distribution channels like cassettes or comic books or movies in a physical form, in which those intellectual property rights were much easier to enforce. Today, we are beginning to see a switch to other forms of enforcement, which might actually be non-constitutional, which actually may be violating the law, but that particularly United States courts, and I suppose also European courts, who know so little about what software is and who know so little about technical questions, have no clue as to how to respond to these things. I mean, here one of the main examples is the case against Microsoft, which, of course, Microsoft was already left off the hook by the Bush administration, but the judge who engaged in illegal businesses. But the judge took a long time to understand the real source of power of Microsoft. The real source of power is that they write both Windows, which is an operating system, the basic software on top of which everything else runs, and at the same time they create word processors, they create spreadsheets, they create graphics programs, they create music programs that run on top of the operating system. Now, a judge that doesn't understand the difference between an application and an operating system, for a judge, both come in a compact disk. You plug them both into your computer and you click on them and you go there and you go. They're the same thing. This judge has to learn on the job what the difference is and how crucial the difference is. The operating system runs the rest of the thing. So if you own Windows and at the same time you own all these programs, well, you can cheat in ways that are illegal. You know what Windows 2000 will be 3 years before the competition. You start rewriting your program for Windows 2000, then you delay the specifications, and by the time you give them to the competition, your programs are already ready for 2000, and theirs are not. So you're exercising monopoly power from within the software, but judges that have no clue about this, they need to be learning on the job about these things. Let's not even mention the case with Napster, right? With Napster, which is software that did not even exist before, the peer-to-peer network software to connect your hard disk to other person's hard disk. We heard it in Antonia's talk this morning, how this bypasses the server or makes every computer both server and client. And you're not going through a central computer anymore. You're just connecting hard disks with one another in a very anarchic kind of way. Well, imagine the judge that had the case for Napster trying to understand this, and how to rule and to make decisions that will be legally binding for many years, because a lot of this will be law by precedent. It's not constitutional changes. It's, well, such the judge in the Napster case said this, so now this is what's going to count as precedent now. So it will have many unintended consequences that some ignorant judge, in half understanding the technology, make some decision that will in fact have many consequences later on. So we are in a very dangerous period of our history in which technology is definitely getting ahead of the law. Now, when the technology gets ahead of the law, it's very easy for corporations to stop trusting the law, both for surveillance and for enforcement. What they are doing increasingly more and more is changing software for law. So now the main emphasis is not so much, I'm going to sue you in court if you copy my cassette, is I'm going to put a special software program in the cassette that's going to make it impossible for you to copy it. Or I'm going to make, for instance, right now, record companies are very worried that people are copying their compact discs into the computers, putting them in MP3 format, and then sending them over the internet to someone else. So now they're trying to put software in the discs themselves, in the music itself, software that will create a noise that you don't hear until it becomes MP3, until it becomes compressed in your computer, in which case you will hear a click, 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 throughout the thing. So in other words, since the enforcement of the intellectual property rights is being challenged by technology, and since the judges seem clueless as to how to make decisions that actually are relevant, corporations are switching more and more to code instead of law as the main surveillance and enforcement mechanism, which has all kinds of consequences, because when law is the enforcement mechanism, there's at least discussion of it. Discussion in courts, discussions among lawyers, discussions in law schools, and there's a long tradition of legal discussion, legal discourse, in which supposedly that discussion and that economics based on this demonized private property and the demonization of money itself. So the question for the left today is whether we need to reconceptualize. We don't want to become free marketeers. That's another ridiculous position. But we wanted to invent new ways, new types of economic thinking that acknowledge the existence of exploitation, that acknowledge the existence of surveillance, that acknowledge the existence of a control that's away from us, that in which we are being controlled instead of we having the control over our lives. And the only way we're going to be able to develop those concepts is not just theoretically, but by actually paying attention to economic experiments that exist out there in the world, some of which have failed, some of which have not failed, but even the ones that failed, we can learn from the failures, and at any rate, any undertaking that we would take to try to change things to also have the same risk of failure, so there's no need too harsh on those who fail. And here I'm going to talk about a specific one, but you can also think about other examples like the microcredit system in Bangladesh, which is a fantastic idea, very simple. How do